And welcome back, or welcome to the On Coaching Podcast with Magness and Marcus. I am Steve Magness, the Deputy Director of High Performance West, coach of the University of Houston, joined by my good friend, colleague, partner in crime, John Marcus, the Director of High Performance West. John, what is up?
You know what's up. We're here to give the people what they want. Come on now. It's time.
It is time. It's 2019. Can you believe that?
Oh, I can. Yes, time flies when you're having fun.
That is true. And rumor has it that you're getting in back to shape. Me,
oh
not
my gosh.
so much, but you, yes.
Hey, I'm just trying to, pick up the slack for all us rusty coaches out there. So
one day we're gonna have a old retired coaches race. Before then,
who can make it the furthest without pulling a muscle? Just that's all it is. Who can make it the furthest without pulling a muscle?
We'll bring Mike Smith and Danny Mackey. We'll relive our glory days.
Oh my god! I don't think we'll make it a lap.
All right. So besides chatting about our retired coaching race. This week we've got what I think is a very interesting topic and one near and dear to my heart. Something that I've constantly fought against for the better part of my coaching career. And that is that the idea that there are magic training paces.
Oh, I feel another all-time great podcast episode coming on right now. Steve gets super heated about this, and so do I, but... Man, we're just going to put a lot of gasoline on this flame.
All right, now that we've got the hype train rolling. So what do we mean by magic training paces? So I'll break it down and then we'll jump right into it. So in the world of distance running, or actually in the world of endurance sport, we've come to believe that there are certain paces or certain intensities or intensity zones that do more than others, right? So if we run at, we'll just throw out a number, 80% of VO2 max, then that is the zone that does something much better than, let's say, 75%, right? Mm-hmm. You might have these like black hole zones that don't do anything in between. So it's this belief that we need to check the box on these different training intensities, training zones in order to maximize performance. And a little bit of history, if we look at where did this come from, it actually rose with the rise in the knowledge of physiology, right?
Yes.
Where we started to be able to classify and name some of these paces intensities that we were running. So people started to measure things like VO2 max and said, hey, at around this pace, people run at their VO2 max. This must be important. And then came, hey, lactate threshold occurs at around this intensity, this pace. This must be important. Or the latest newfangled one, critical velocity. This occurs at this percentage of max. It must be important. And we're here to tell you that, well, there might be importance to that. There are no magical training paces. There is nothing that is vastly superior to anything else. It's all relative, right?
Exactly. The thing you have to do is you have to ask yourself, where do we see similarities in this type of presentation and thought process? And you see it in nutrition, right? Every year, there's some kind of new nutrient or food that is the magic food. Acai berries, pomegranate, beet juice, coconut oil. We keep going on and on and on, right? Like, just eat this one nutrient or food and you're just going to magically just be... No, that's not how nature works, right? More and more we always have to go back to nature. Like I posted a tweet out the other day where it said, first art, then science, and finally nature. And what I meant by that is there's an artistry about any craft that one must understand. You're just drawn to it. It's exciting. It calls you. And then you want to know the technical aspects of it, the X's and O's, how to get really refined, and that's the science of it, right? Test theories and have it be replicable over and over and over again. But finally, what we all learn is it's nature. Science is just explaining nature. Nature was first, and then came science. It wasn't science, then nature. And this is a very similar circumstance. And you got to remember, right, before the rise of physiology and the rise of the ability to compartmentalize and reduce all these different elements, Ron Clark went out there and, set a bunch of world records and was the first man under 28 minutes, racing 4 times a week, running 3 times a day as he felt. You know what I mean? So the reality is modern training and physiology is important and it's useful to know, but it's not essential in terms of there are examples of many, many athletes who have come before and many, many athletes who will come after and coaches who didn't know everything about anything, but still were able to get themselves prepared for them because they understood that that athlete or this circumstance and environment was an experiment of one, and they just focused on themselves and what they needed to do to be the best for a race day. Now, it's very comforting too, and it's easy to get, called by the siren song that if you just do this one magic pace, that all your training woes and efforts will, be alleviated. And it's not the case at all. It's you have to ask yourself, well, yeah, if you haven't been doing a certain training pace or training intensity or duration, and then you start doing it from scratch, in the first 4 to 6 weeks, we know you're going to get, a big gain. Why? Clean slate phenomena. Go back to podcast 1. We always got to remember the clean slate phenomena. And then once we get past that threshold, what happens in that plateau of mastery or plateau of, gains where you don't see anything happening? Now what? So we always are, I think, astute to go back and look at nature.
So I was at a coaching conference in Canada a couple weeks ago, and Steven Seiler, the famed researcher behind the 80-20 analysis or 80-20 training stuff, presented a great slide on a study he was involved in, and when he looked at the periodization of interval training, right? And they had 3 different groups and 3 different styles of intervals that they did. And it ranged, I don't remember exactly, but it ranged to everyone. Maybe there was short intervals of 10 by 2 minutes, and then there were medium length of 4 by 6 minutes, and then there were long intervals of I don't know, 3 by 12 minutes, something in that range, right? So you had short, medium, and long. And what they did is they did these intervals twice a week along with their easy distance stuff, and they would do that for, I think it was 3 or 4 weeks, and then switch to the next, right? And they said, hey, we want to know what's best, right? Should people do long intervals and go to short? Should they go short intervals to long? Should it not really matter in terms of we'll go long, short, medium? What did they look at? And it was really interesting. The data they presented basically showed that regardless of where they started, they adapted really quickly in those first couple weeks to whatever they were doing, and then they plateaued. And it didn't really matter if they did 16-minute intervals to start or 2-minute intervals to start. They were going to adapt and then plateau. And then when something else was introduced, they were going to adapt a little bit and then plateau. What order? Mm-hmm. Didn't matter. And I think that is another demonstration of that clean slate phenomenon, where it's if you provide a new stimulus, you are going to adapt to it, and it's going to seem like magic, right?
Yeah.
And you're going to say, oh man, we just introduced this type of training. This must be the key. This has to be it. Mm-hmm. And what happens a lot of times is our athletes get fooled by that, right? We know this as coaches. What happens when you take an athlete and you come off summer base mileage maybe, and then you start introducing interval workouts? What happens? Athletes get really fast for a little bit, and then your athletes say, hey, the key to running fast was doing these quick interval workouts. Why am I doing all this other stuff? This is the key. And it's no. Mm-hmm. That's just a momentary thing. So I think as coaches, we have to get out of falling for this short-term acute phase and retroactively assigning too much importance to a thing that looks like it improved without seeing the big picture.
And I think, too, it's our posture and our interpretation and our positioning that needs to be questioned as well. If you go back to Steve and Brad's book, Peak Performance, they lay it out there real simple, right? Remind me of this equation that was so simple?
Stress
Steve?
plus rest equals growth.
Right. So remember, adaptation is a recovery response to a stress. Without a recovery period, there is no improvement. Long and fast running, sprinting, strength training, etc., they all cause damage to our bodies. And in the recovery response to those activities is the source of improvement. I'm going to say that again. The recovery response to these activities is the source of improvement. Not the activities, the recovery response. So this is where I get kind of heated about everyone saying, oh, this is the best method to damage ourselves, right? Because that's essentially what we're talking about when we're talking about workouts. How do we damage the athletes? What's the best way to damage them? Now, we can go out and say there's a lot of good ways to damage them, and Steven Seller's pointed that exactly correctly. Like, you can damage them like this. You can damage them for this long. You can damage them for that long. You damage at this intensity. You're just creating damage. How you recover, how you adapt, that is the source of improvement. We cannot forget that. And far too often, it's so sexy to talk about ways to damage ourselves or damage athletes. But yet, why are we not sitting and saying, hey, what are the best methods or modalities for recovery? Steve, what's the number one method or modality for recovery?
Sleep.
Yes. Oh my gosh. Sleep. Like, it's not sexy, but I guarantee you, if you have two athletes, right? And I would love someone to do this study, or a set of athletes, just put them through the exact same training. Like, just take a bunch of high school 932 milers, put them all through the exact same training, and they do exactly the same stuff all together, same paces, big group thing. But then make it so one group gets 4 hours of sleep, one group gets 6, one group gets 8, and one group gets 10 a night for 6 weeks. I bet you a gazillion dollars that the 10-hour sleep a night group is going to see the most rapid improvement.
Yeah, 100%. And that's a good way to look at it, is the damage. That reframes it a little bit. From just putting all the emphasis on the workout improving you. It's that workout damages you, and then you have to recover and come back.
Yeah, I always remember something Jerry Schumacher told me early on in my career. He goes, especially because we love to look at say the elite or the highest level athletes and the crazy workouts that they're doing. And we tend to glorify these ultra difficult gut wrenching interval sessions as the secret to big improvement. But the reality is, for most of those athletes, that workout is just a reflection of the fitness they already possess. They already have, right? They're not, why would Jerry damage an Evan Digger and have him go deep to the well? No. That fitness was built over the course of months of aerobic, development, strength and conditioning, et cetera. Years, in fact, for say Evan, right? It's a multiplier. It compounds, but we think in such short-term cycles, right? We've been conditioned to think in 3-month indoor and outdoor seasons or cross-country seasons. How are we not thinking in, why is a cycle of thought not, 36 months, right, instead of 12? But yet we have this short-term view, and so we try to pack all this stuff in, when in reality, and I think Steve can speak to this as well with athletes he's worked. The athletes that I've coached that have had a lot of success, I knew that they were going to have success when they had 6 to 9 months of uninterrupted, consistent, not exciting training without any blips before their big breakout. Same Danny Mackey can attest to this too. I was talking to him the other day. He goes, I knew Drew Windle was about to do something special in indoor because he only missed 9 days the previous year from training. That's a key performance indicator that the Brooks Beast track is how many days off or how many unplanned, absences from training do you have for whatever reason, illness, injury, etc. And when Drew went to only 9, oh man, that was the thing that really set him up. So think about that, right? His whole 2017 preparation or training and racing, etc., without much, missing and a lot of recovery and a lot of adaptation, that set him up for a silver medal indoors in 2018.
Yeah, no, it's a very basic measure, but it's a really good one. A couple of years ago, I looked at our top athletes in terms of improvement on our college team versus like practices missed, and it correlated extremely well, where the people who were able to show up the most got better, right? And the people who either got banged up or didn't show up to things, like, they didn't. And it's almost too simple, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's the most important thing.
Yeah, and so think about, again, go back to the garden, right? Go back to nature. I've said this many times. It's always bet on nature and be in harmony with nature. Just because you can't see the seed sprouting and you can't see the seed growing underneath the soil doesn't mean it's not progressing, right? And that a lot of times what happens with training, we get to these plateaus and we think it's a plateau. We're like, I'm not getting weekly progress. Oh my gosh, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with the athlete? Why are your time not getting faster? Well, sometimes there's a delayed compounding effect that happens. And as you just do the work for a month, maybe the athlete doesn't get better. But then in terms of like week to week races or, week to week progressions that you've fictitiously or arbitrarily invented for them, because there's some periodization data table that says that has to be like this theoretical thing, right? In reality, sometimes it takes a little bit for things to compound and for things to actually get digested and adapted. Like I always remind people, athletes I work with, that the majority of times you're not even going to feel the effects of, say, like a central nervous system based workout, like reap the positive impact from it from about, maybe if you're really mega super fit, like 2 weeks after this, but most likely 28 days, right? Roughly, give or take, depending on your fitness or degree of consistency going in. And for like aerobic based stuff, that's probably going to be like a 6-week delay.
and the great part about this, or the interesting part about this, is that delay leads to a misattribution of what caused you to improve.
Yes, ding, 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 winner.
And that's what we're talking about a lot of right now, is that it's easy to misattribute what got us there. A lot of times athletes do it all the time. They look at what did they do the week or two their best performance, right? And like that might tell you something, but it doesn't tell you a lot. It tells you maybe like how you didn't screw up and overcook yourself leading into a race, right? But it doesn't tell you how you got to that point. And that's where I think we run into the danger of assigning, or saying that we have these magic intensities, is because like we can't attribute what changes performance that well from a like just a artistic standpoint of coaches watching, or even a scientific standpoint of saying, hey, if you do this, you're gonna improve A, B, and C, and D. Like we can't do it that well because it's such a complex big picture. So it's hard to break it down into things. And instead, what we know is we need these variety of ingredients, and it's not that any of them are special. It's just that these variety of ingredients will get us to a point, depending on the race, where the athlete can perform.
Well, I'm going to try to break it down. I've been mulling over this for a long time, and this first time I'm presenting it, and so I can get Steve's honest opinion and feedback without him knowing, and also for him to rip it to shreds if he wants. But how I've been thinking more recently about training is actually what we're trying to do is create anti-fragility or fatigue tolerance in athletes, right? So there's 5 main types of fatigue. You have central nervous system fatigue, you have metabolic fatigue, muscular fatigue, energy fatigue, and emotional fatigue, right? So those 5 fatigues, now in any type of training activity, you can emphasize one or maybe 2, or have a correlative or secondary or tertiary fatigue that also has benefited from that, right? Because that's what any type of training is expanding the capacity or the tolerance to that type of fatigue, right? Say acidosis training with lactate threshold training, or high speed endurance type training, right? What we're doing is we're creating tolerance to the acidic state in our blood, right? That happens when all these positive protons release from the ATP molecules and get in and just sit there, right? Otherwise, what happens is you slow down substantially and or throw up. So, but, so think about that, right? So when you're saying, oh, threshold, aerobic training, lactic threshold, anaerobic threshold, whichever one you want to call it, speed endurance, etc., glycolytic, type energy pathways, whatever you're talking about in a very simple term, one of the 5 types of fatigues, or emphasizing mainly one and then trying to get the others to kind of build tolerance to as well. And that is what adaptation is. That is what learning is. That is what growth, development, getting better, and in my opinion, it's getting a higher tolerance to one or all of those fatigues.
Yeah, I like that approach. I think it's changing the focal point, right?
Yeah.
Where the focal point shifts from, hey, I want you to run at this intensity, to what are we trying to accomplish in this workout? And I think, if you look back, or if you think back as a coach, what are you doing? When you're writing those workouts, you're thinking about, what am I trying to accomplish during this, right? When I sit there and write my workout for my athlete, let's take Brian Barraza, for example. Last year as a college kid, I was writing his workouts and dictating because I knew where I wanted him to go in terms of fatigue, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is this a go to their well, feel like your legs are about to fall off and can't move and throw up?
And that's like all 5 fatigues, right?
Exactly. Or is it something that, like, hey, I don't want them to be emotionally spent, but I want some sort of work on it, so I'm going to get some neuromuscular, fatigue, right? So, like, you're almost patterning that if you think about it as a coach. But again, it's that shifting of the focal point that I think is the important point, because I think when we look at the physiological model, the model is to assume if I run at this pace or this intensity, then, B will happen.
Right.
But if you change the focal point and say, hey, I'm looking to try and get to B, then what do I do to get there? Right? Mm-hmm. Instead of making the assumption this pace equals B. It's like simple, and maybe I'm going to lose our followers, our listeners on this, but I think if you map it out in terms of like just a simple math equation on like what are you focusing on, just like that stress plus rest equals growth. Simple allows you to understand the process and what are you focusing on. I'd suggest the same thing for like looking at workouts, because I think where we run into a hole here is when we make those assumptions that if we, let's take the newfangled term, if we run at critical velocity, then we're going to get, aerobic adaptations in our fast twitch muscle fibers. Well, there is absolute zero to validate that statement.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can't do it. It's impossible. And even if I was to isolate everything in a lab and like control everything, which would be really hard, and I saw, hey, after doing this type of training only, they improve, these aerobic enzymes and this fast twitch muscle. Well, that can't translate to the masses, right? That applies to the one individual that you did this, or the handful that you did this, because that's what exercise physiology is small studies. So I think, like, when we look at these things, we need to step back and think about these things, right? One of my favorite studies to put up, and I'll try and include the picture in the show notes, is they took all these athletes and they tested them with VO2 max, all this different stuff. And they said, hey, we're going to train you all at, I think it was like 80% of VO2 max. So some sort of tempo-ish effort, right? 80% of VO2 max. That's the training pace. We're going to do it all in the lab. I think it was on bikes for like 4 to 6 weeks, something like that. We're going to take biopsies and we're going to look at, what happened. And the variation in terms of looking at like stuff on the cellular level, from like enzymes, aerobic and anaerobic enzymes, to looking at some, other markers at a very, damage markers, all this stuff were wide and vast. And they were all training at their defined 80%. And when I saw that, like, I'm sitting there being like, all right, well, that tells you that it's pretty much impossible and meaningless to, use percentages of max, or to have, like, say that everyone's going to respond in the same exact way at this intensity, because there's so much variability in humans.
Yeah.
And we see this, right? We see this out as coaches when we look and we say, hey, my top 3 runners are all similar in the 5K. I'm going to go do a tempo run based off, a percentage of their 5K. And, Johnny over there is breathing super easy. Well, Brian can't talk, and James, like, is breathing crazy. Like, you see the variation in it, even though they're training at very similar percentages or similar what there should be thresholds or whatever have you. Like, it's easy when you look at it, So,
and I love the audacity of coaches, who, misinterpret these charts or tables or prescriptions, and then, have athletes do the work, and then they don't run the time that they're supposed to correlate to, and like, well, you messed up. The coach saying to the athlete, no, coach, you messed up because you couldn't see the N of 1 experiment, the individual athlete here, where the mental model or the chart or the concept that you're using is just an abstract, is just a guide. It's a map. We always have to remember, though, right? The map does not equal the territory. And I think it's very comforting to want the map to be your hack, your shortcut, because we human beings love the shortcuts. Oh my goodness, so much. But this is really hard work to get, someone to improve and be the best they can be. I was having this conversation the other day with Daniel Herrera. It's like, look, Dan, it's just you versus you now. I don't care who's in the race. I don't care who you're lining up against. This shouldn't be a concern. All we're trying to track is, are you getting better? Are you better, compared to a previous incarnation of you? That is success. That's progress. That's mastery. You can control that. You can work on that. But you can't control if you're better than this competitor or that competitor, or if you beat them today or they beat you tomorrow. That's out of your scope. And why would we sit here obsessing about those externals when the only thing we have is the individuality and the internal?
Yeah, exactly. And, as coaches and athletes sit here and listen to this, and maybe they're confused or not, but I would challenge you to go watch other people do a workout, right? Go watch your teammates or, friends, a group of them preferably, do a workout. And watch and see if you can notice the different levels and kinds of fatigue within that group, right? It could be 4 or 5 guys doing 1K repeats. And watch their different breaking points, and when you see stuff falter and all that stuff. That right there is the goal. That's the indicator of what you're trying to do, right? Mm-hmm. That is it, okay? Versus this, hey, I'm gonna assign you a exact pace or intensity, and like you have to be on this, and if you're not, like you're done for. I think the best demonstration of this is actually living and training in Houston in the summer, right? I was actually talking to a good friend and a great coach, Forrest Braden, who's over at William and Mary now, and we were talking about, hey man, like we can't do those 10-mile tempo runs in the summer, or those long things in the summer, and he can't either as much as he could when he was at UCLA, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we were talking about, all right, how do we get a similar effect without cranking them, because they're going to be burnt emotionally, psychologically, physically, physiologically if we kind of do these crazy things. So, how do you do that? So it's a different challenge, and you can't go based on the intensities, even if you adjust the intensity. Even we say, hey, I'm going to give them 20 seconds a mile slower because of the heat and humidity. Well, you still can't go do 10 miles at that intensity, even if you've adjusted, because it's a different fatigue. Mm-hmm. So, like, keep that in mind as you're going through these things.
And that's where it's important to do a complete and thorough diagnostic on and frequent diagnostic on your athletes, right? You have to go through and check each and make an assessment. Okay, where, how wide is or thin is their central nervous tolerance or fatigue? What about their metabolic fatigue, muscular fatigue, energy fatigue, and emotional fatigue? What does that tolerance look like for each athlete? We spend as distance coaches a lot of time obsessing about the metabolic fatigue component because we erroneously think that it will magically impact all the other ones beneficially. And that thing, I think, is super vital for us to understand is that I think that's super vital for us to understand. The emotional fatigue is one that it's hard to put a hard number on. We can put a hard number on, say, the metabolic fatigue, right? And that's what we do with all the varying paces and the different energy pathways that ATP is utilized and how our body interprets fuels. And we call these things different, very cool physiological terms. And that's great and that's important to know. We're not discrediting that at all. But what I think is we have to think about is central nervous fatigue that can take over and stop an athlete cold, in a heartbeat. And also the muscular fatigue as well can do the same thing. So what I mean by muscular fatigue is are your joints or how you're loading improperly, right? Are you getting overused soft tissue injuries? And if you haven't addressed, say, some type of strength and conditioning regime that's consistent, if you haven't addressed mobility, and if you haven't addressed biomechanics, that muscular fatigue is going to exponentially increase and limit an athlete as well. Same thing with energy fatigue, right? Your energy fatigue, if the athlete's not fueled well, if they're not getting enough sleep, if they're running on highly damaged muscles, right, with high cortisol because of the different stress and everything, that's going to be important too, is understanding that energy fatigue is something that needs to be managed and created and increased as well. So it's important, I think, if we're going to, re-pivot and think in this model, because they're all just models that are on offer, right? But if you're saying, how for each athlete do we assess the different types of fatigues? Where's their biggest liability right now? What's holding them back the most? Where's a big strength? Something that we can build on? And where are other ones that are going to be important priorities later on once we clean up this biggest liability? And that's how I always work, right? Is what's the biggest thing holding the athlete back right now? 9 times out of 10, it's not the metabolic component, because the metabolic component, that just requires a lot of consistency of training and effort. But what are the things that limit consistency? And that's where we have to ask, okay, what are those limiting factors in that fatigue catalog that we, in our taxonomy that we've offered here today? And if you do that, it becomes very simple, I think, in my mind, to decide what paces or intensities someone should run, because you're basically saying, what damage should we cause today? Is today a high damage day, a low damage day, a medium damage day? What was the previous day's worth of damage? Not just in training, but then too, compounding it outside of training in the other 21 hours of the day. Were they stressed out from a test, breaking up, with a boyfriend or girlfriend? Did they not get a lot of sleep? Did they travel? Were they up really late, right? There's that study that, it was just, published that says even one night staying up late can have a big disruption, on an athlete or any person's hormonal levels. Huge disruption, right? Those subtleties, while, require a lot of extra digging, are much more vital in my mind than saying we're going to run critical velocity or VO2 max or your lactate threshold workout this week, and that's the thing that's going to get you good.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think, again, it might sound like nuance, but it's important to, reframe things. And I think, if I step back and I look at, well, why do we focus so much on these intensity zones or these magical workouts that, people think you need? I think it's one, because we, as humans, we love to classify things, right? Mm-hmm. We love neat order and classification. And then the second part is it's the way we're taught. So if you look at the endurance coaching world, we're basically taught from a physiological model, right? We learn the physiology in these coaches, clinics where we look at, hey, this is VO2 max, this is lactate threshold, this is, anaerobic capacity. And that's all really good to know. But what happens is when we always come at things from those models, then we are saying that this is the most important thing and that our training should be based on this, and our training should be based on checking these models, these physiological but really metabolic zones off. And when you say, hey, we're going to check these metabolic zones off, then what we're doing there is saying that, like, this is what's important, and we're forgetting, in your parlance, all these other kinds of fatigue, right?
And also, too, it becomes a compliance activity then.
Yes.
Because you have to check the boxes off. The athlete has to check the box off. If they don't, something's wrong with them. If they don't get the benefit they're supposed to get from this type of workout, well, then there's something wrong with you. And I think you need to turn the mirror around, coach, and say, actually, maybe and question your thinking. And is your thinking askewed? Because our job, right, is to do no harm by the athletes. Our job as coaches is to help and enhance. Our job, like Alcarius said, is not to motivate, but just to tether out and encourage and guide that person's passion for where they want to take themselves.
Yeah, exactly. Couldn't have said it better. I think that, I think that's an important concept to get across or to wrap your head around as a coach, because it's easy to fall into that trap of check the box, right? Of, hey, I did this, I've checked my aerobic stuff, and I think, or my VO2 max or whatever have you. And I think the other part that is really important is if you look back and you know your history of training, like you alluded to at the beginning with Ron Clark, is that somehow, think about it, somehow runners have stumbled upon realizing that they need to train at a wide variety of intensities, right? Mm-hmm. And that, somehow they can do repeats at around this pace and make it, and around this pace and make it, et cetera, et cetera. And they just kind of figured this out, right? Ron Clark didn't say, I'm going to do 2400s at this pace because I'm trying to run out my lactate threshold or critical velocity or VO2 max, right? He kind of just did it because this was probably going to get him the level of fatigue and speed that he needed on that day, right? Zatopek as well, right? If you look at his famed 40 to 60 by 400, right? He didn't, assign a pace. He kind of figured it out. And I think there's almost a beauty to having, this wide variety of intensities and paces figured out, intuitively by, we'll call it nature.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Before having to come in and explain why these might work or why these might be doing something to our body.
And you got to look at, too, like Bill Rogers, Jerry Lindgren, like these, even like Peter Snell, these high mileage guys, they knew something, right? I mean, Bill Rogers ran triples. I mean, with regularity. Steve Jones, same deal, triples, right? And we can look at those outliers, but I always wonder, like, what did they know? As well as, like, say, Peter Coe and Seb Coe. They knew something too, and Peter Coe has put a lot of books out there, and he invested a lot of time and energy for the middle distance runner specifically in creating a very high acidosis buffer through doing highly skill-specific training. I was just reading something with Peter Coe, and he knew, like, Seb Coe's acid test was essentially doing 8 times 300 meters at 36 to 34 with 45 seconds rest. When Seb could do that, not eyes popping out of his head, with minimal fatigue, because being able to run that fast, you got to think of the degree of competence that you have and the degree of anti-fatigue or fatigue tolerance you have in all those areas, right? If you're running 8 times 300 at 36 to 34 with 45 seconds rest, I mean, metabolic fatigue, pretty high tolerance. Central nervous fatigue, pretty high tolerance. Muscular, high tolerance. Energy, high tolerance. Emotional, high tolerance. Like, yeah, you're ready to set world records. But the way they did it was a progressive exposure. They would run that workout, and what he would do is he would run first. He get the paces down, right? So get the pace down. So they get the pace down, 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 and then once he could do like 6 to 8 times 40 or 39 or 38, then they start to cut the recoveries, right? Because he knew there was a threshold. Like, you can't just go here and, all right, we're just going to go run 300s at 30 and call it good. But he knew, okay, skill specific, what are we trying to do in the mile? What type of acidosis tolerance or buffering are we trying to get? Okay, we want to get here to get here to get here. And so it was very scientific in terms of it was very regimented. It was progressive. They only progress when like they had more than enough data, not one session, but multiple sessions. And Seb also being like, yeah, it's kind of feeling really easy now to go at 40s with 2 minutes rest. Okay, we can, start to chop it down. That was signaling to Co that it was time to progress. And you know what I mean? That really worked. But also too, acidosis training from like say lactate tolerance with tempo runs of 20 minutes, like the Daniels model, two times 20 minutes, that can work too. So it's tough, like as Steve said, to discern, and that's the key. Every coach has to be able to discern kind of, things that are too good to be true from tried and true principles that we just can't, wishy-wash on at all. Even when it comes to something like, say, peaking, right? V Hill's peaking was a drastic cut in volume and intensity to make sure the athlete felt really fresh. A lot of other athletes, and people are like, oh, no peaking at all. We maintain the volume we have because that's going to disrupt homeostasis. But then too, V Hill was coaching athletes at altitude at high intensity. And at 7,000 feet, maybe that's what you have to do at Adams State versus at your sea level. Maybe disrupting the homeostasis at sea level is not a good idea, right? So discern those nuances or ingredients that influenced those people's success, because it can't be blanket. There's no such thing. It's impossible. Same thing with altitude training, right? I remember Robert Chapman presented a study from USATF that showed not everyone's a high responder at altitude training, believe it or not. So even though they know 7,000 feet is kind of like the highest area for a response, not everyone, even people going up with like high hemoglobin, high ferritin levels, they didn't respond. Like Alan Webb, not a responder to altitude at all. It actually deflated rather than elevated. However, for athletes I've worked with, like Tara Welling, very high responder. We'd send her up 2-3 times a year because you know what? She got a response and we knew it worked for just her. Now, I didn't send everyone I coached up to altitude, but only her, because we knew it worked for her.
And that's kind of the beauty of stepping back and seeing training as this, hey, what sort of adaptation am I trying to get? What sort of stimulus can I do? Because it's, it's like the example you said there. If we take, try and improve your aerobic fitness or tempo or whatever have you, you can do that traditional Daniel style. Or you could go run 150 meter repeats with Igloy on a track and get the same thing done, even though one's doing a 4-mile tempo and one's doing 150 meter repeats with 50 meter float or whatever have you. And they're doing them at different intensities and different paces and all that stuff. And that's why I think it's just really important to get away from this magic training zone pace intensity model, whatever you want to call it, because that just limits your creativity, right? It limits your options for how to solve the coaching problem, right? If John and I are sitting there coming up designing training, if we only have a couple intensities and workout styles to go to, then our options get really limited with the vast array of humans out there and the vast array of ways they respond to things, right? So I think it's important to give yourself some freedom, give yourself some creativity and say, hey, I'm trying to tackle this problem. I'm not trying to, run at this magic pace.
And the best way to do that is, there's 2 avenues that I have found for me that afford me that. One, continuous and vicious studying, reading, like just go back, see what everyone and anyone did. I mean, whether it's the Penguin or Igloy or Cerity or John McDonald, like, or you just go and just read and just say, huh, that's an interesting way they solved that problem. And then two, I think, this is where we as a coaching community really need to make advances is ask your peers, ask your colleagues, ask your mentors, ask them. I ask Stephen, like Danny Mackey, all the time, hey, what do you guys think? Hey, what are your thoughts on this? Hey, I'm not sure about this. I just ask and ask and ask and ask. Like, it's not like it's supposed to be a riddle and I'm the one who has to solve it and be the king of the hill. It's like, I mean, I definitely have my biases when it comes to solving problems based on my knowledge and experience and wisdom and understanding. But other people have more, intelligence or experience or understanding than I do in certain areas. So I'll ask them. And you know what? I've never regretted asking someone's opinion about how to solve a training problem. Because at the end of the day, right, successful training is not only hard work, but it involves a lot of thought and constant decision making. That is the hardest thing to encapsulate because you just have to be decisive and you have to trust your gut rather than kind of wish and wash. Now, we're not sitting here and saying that critical philosophy has no value whatsoever. There's definitely value there. I'd be hubristic to discredit and say otherwise. But it's one ingredient. It's one nutrient. The acai berry is good for you. I do not disagree that. A blueberry has antioxidants. Yes, include them in the diet. But don't go and say, okay, I'm going to make my diet now disproportionately blueberries because we said this is the magic fruit.
Yeah, and that's probably one of the reasons why that analogy works really well. It's not that blueberries are bad for you. They're good for you, right?
They're great.
You should be eating blueberries, but you shouldn't make your whole diet blueberries, right? You shouldn't make the majority of your diet. You should follow the tried and true, but never really appreciated advice of like eating diverse, healthy foods, right?
Yeah, what's worked for a long time, It hasn't killed us, right? It's like, and that's where we inherit, the mistakes of all the previous generations, all the previous coaches and athletes that come before us. So we're actually sitting in a great position, but you do have to go back and you have to be a thorough student of history.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's incredibly important to do the work. And if you look at, things John has put out on High Performance West, I put on Science of Running, a lot of it is, and listen to this podcast too much, a lot of it is diving through the history. I mean, I was actually today, for our High Performance West Scholar Program, I was looking at a couple books from like the 1900s. 1907, I think, was one. On what they were doing, and was it groundbreaking? No, but at the time it was. And what it does is it gives you an appreciation for how are they solving this problems? How did we start this journey towards the training paradigm that we're at now? And it was interesting because, in that one article, it was written by James Sullivan, who you might better known for the Sullivan Award for amateur athletes. Mm-hmm. And he was talking about training, and he was talking about the fear of what they called staleness at that point, which we now call overtraining. And he was, outlining some of the things that he thought staleness, which, corresponds pretty well to what the research says. But it was really interesting, and he noted that everyone was worried about overtraining, but the American athletes didn't have enough endurance or stamina compared to the British athletes who were doing more volume. So you see the beginnings of saying, hey, maybe our American folks, we need to run a little bit more, right? Which, when, again, at that point, no one was doing that much, but 2 or 3 days of run a 400 or run a 200 or something like that, one getting the job done. But you can see that thought process going and understand where we came from to get to the point we're at now.
And this is one thing, going back to nature, I know about every single human being on the planet that is free of deformities or, any kind of a dysfunction, whether cognitive or physical, is you're a learning machine. You can learn so fast. Like, I've read 75 books this last year, completed 75 books. It was like Neo in the Matrix. Like, I know Kung Fu. Like, you just can learn so quick. Watch a baby learning how to walk. They learn how to walk very rapidly, or people who learn languages. And the reason, say, a lot of children can learn so quickly is not because of how we used to think. The brain was more plastic. They just have less biases and hangups about failing and learning. And that's how we learn, right? We learn by doing. I was talking to my father the other day, and I go, how the school system teaches kids today is unfortunate, because the way we teach kids is we say you have to have the right answer. There is the answer and is the right answer. And if you don't have that one, you're wrong. But if we taught a little kid how to walk that way, say you got to learn how to walk, you have to know how to walk now. It's time to know how to walk. No, the kid would never walk. But what we do is they get up, they fall. We encourage them. They walk a few steps, they plateau. We help them a little bit. We get them, they walk, they fall. But we keep encouraging them every step of the way, right? We keep saying, you're getting better. You're improving for you. It's not about, can you walk? Can you be the earliest baby to walk ever? It's just about just get to walking, and you can do it. And that, I think, is really important to look at and know and realize we are learning machines. And frequency is the key, right? How do you learn a language? You go immerse yourself and only speak that language, because you have to frequently use it. Bill Rogers, frequency. He was running 3 times a day for 3 years. Then he won Boston. Frequency. But the goal is everyone only has so high of a tolerance of frequency that they can do an activity because of the damage. And so you have to ask, if I'm going to subject this athlete to this workout, how much damage am I causing? How much damage do I think? And then being like, say, Charlie Munger, create a safety of margin or a moat and say, okay, we're going to do 5 by a mile at 5K pace with 3 minutes rest. That's probably going to create a lot of damage. So I'm going to give them 3 days rest at least, because there's all this damage created. And if we need to take more rest and recovery because the damage was more than I anticipated when I wrote this, that tells me that, one, they might have a longer recovery horizons and therefore not be as fit as I thought, or 2, maybe not taking care of, themselves in an appropriate fashion away from the track. That's in our dialogue. So instead of saying, the other way to say is, well, here's this outline, it has to be like this: 5 by a mile at 5K pace on this day, 2 days later, critical velocity, 2 days later, 2 times 20 minutes at lactic threshold, a day later, like long run. We tend to just create the scheme and then fit the athletes in the scheme in kind of this Western mindset. And my challenge and what I've been working on is try to flip that, have the scheme fit the athlete, right? Have the athlete dictate the rhythm of the scheme, based off their feedback. And if they are adapting, i.e. recovering from the damage that you've subject them to in the time horizons you anticipate or not.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better. And I think if you take anything away from this podcast and our frequent rambling on this, it's just to change your perspective a little bit. Look at things through a different lens. Like, don't get trapped into, seeing things only through a physiological model, or if you're a sprint coach, only a biomechanical model, right? Mm. And if you do that, then it frees you up to solve the problem of getting athletes better in a number of directions. And that's what we're trying to do, is solve this problem. And if we have more options out there versus, oh man, this guy doesn't look very good aerobically. Well, what do? We'll just go do a bunch of tempo or threshold runs. Right? Mm-hmm. If there are more options to do than that, then your likelihood of, improving and keeping improvement goes up through the roof. So that's what I would encourage you guys to just step back and think again.
You made this comment, Steve. It reminds me. You said, because Steve and I have inherited a lot of athletes, post-collegiate athletes after 1 or 2 coaches, and we do take a look at, our colleagues' trainings that they, subject the athletes to before we work with them. And we all have this bias, right? We all have this bias to we have our go-to, problem solver type, block of training. Like, the athlete's not as fit as they were, or they didn't perform as we thought. We have this go-to style of training that we're going to do for a condensed consolidated block. And get them back to snuff, right? It's super interesting.
Yeah, exactly. No, we were talking about this, me, you, and Danny Mackey a little bit, and I'm fortunate in the post-collegiate world to again get to see all these college kids training logs and some post-collegiate athletes who are on different stuff, and I have a lot of respect for all the other coaches, and all of them do it. The vast majority do a really good job of figuring things out, and solving these problems. But what you see again and again is that we all have our own bias. Is that, as you stated, like if our back's against the wall and we need a big marathon specific workout, then you can see people go a certain direction. Or if an athlete is getting ready to race a big race, we all have our go-to workouts to that are our comfort zone to fix. Or the most interesting part is if an athlete is struggling a little bit, to see what workouts they then do after a poor race or poor series of races. And again, if you've seen 2 or 3 or 4 coaches logs, like we tend to do the same thing, and I do too. I know, when I can't figure something out, a lot of times, like, I'll go to this workout or do this for a week to try and do it, because that's my bias. So I think it's important to almost see and understand that. Not that it's necessarily a bad thing, but just to be aware you're doing it versus just kind of going through the motions and checking the box.
And, all this stuff, like making the investment of continuous education and finding reputable sources. And, it's one reason why everyone who listens to the podcast is listening, and we are blessed, and thank you all for it. But Steve and I are just learners as well, right? We're not, by no means do I tout being the expert in XYZ or ABC, nor does Steve, even though, he has books out and all these things are the accoutrements of expertise. It's keeping that learner mindset, right? And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight the Scholar Supreme seminar that Steve and I created last spring that's still available for people to go through. By and far, we've had like 50 people go through, and every single person has been transformed by it. It's at a higher price point, and it's not about making all this money. It's just Steve and I sweated a lot to create this. I mean, I still think we're not charging enough for like the many late nights that we encountered and lack of sleep, but I'm really glad we did it. But I'm also like, oh, if we're gonna do another one, it was like giving birth, for me and Steve and I. But it is something to check out, because we do go through kind of the history of distance running in a very concise and distance training and modern distance training from like 1900s on, in a very rapid fire, concise pattern, so we can see where we started from, what incarnations and mutations happened, and how we got to here. And then we actually provide hyper specific examples of all types of training: 800, 1500, mile, 3K, steeple, marathon, half marathon, that for our actual athletes that we worked with, and you can see what their training was. And every single coach who's done it, who's gone through it, has thanked us, more than I thought. It's like, no, you guys paid us. Like, you don't need to thank us. Like, thank you. But people have been very excited about it. So check it out. The Scholar Supreme seminar. It is really juicy, and Steve and I are hoping to get the courage to fork over another one, because they're needed, and they're also a lot of fun to do.
A lot of fun, but a lot of work. But yeah, check those things out. You can find the links. We'll put the links in the show notes too. I'd be remiss also if I didn't say one more thing in closing. Is I was talking to Dan Herrera yesterday. We're just having our kind of annual or weekly annual check-in about where we want to. He wants to take his running and what he wants from his running, etc. And I told Dan, I go, Dan, the moment I can no longer identify ways for you to improve, that is the time to leave me, because you have outgrown me and I you. And that is the truth. Like, as coaches, if we only have so many tools in our toolbox to solve problems, it is imperative that either you get better or you set the athlete free if you don't know how to help them get better. Because if you're just saying it's all about lactic threshold, or it's all about mileage, or it's all about VO2 connects, or it's all about critical velocity, but then that athlete for a 6 to year period is not seeing any growth, and they're being religiously
prudent and bought in with the type of training methodology and guidance you're offering, it's where you have to say, look, I don't know how to get you better. And either call a colleague or shop them around or set them free and wish them luck, because then if you just, both of you are hanging on and just doing the same thing over and over again without and expecting like a different result, right? That's the definition of insanity.
Yeah, couldn't agree more with that. I think that's why it's important as a coach to always looking for new tools in your toolbox, right? And not to become the guy who says like, oh, this is the best way to train and this is it. Because the moment you do that, you're limiting your toolbox to this one thing. And and in fact, if you do it publicly, you further limit yourself almost from a subconscious level, because you're saying like, this is what I'm known for. I can't change it, right? Even if I find something better, because this is what I'm known for.
And then all success is through that lens as well, right? The only reason we had success is because of this element or component. And it's like, we're just all chefs, man. It's better to have a lot of ingredients and be able to craft a lot of different dishes with the ingredients you have and don't have too, right? That's part of the fun of this, the challenge of coaching. It never gets easier, but it's constant problem solving. And everyone I know who is in this profession and has stayed in it loves it, because that challenge is the thing that gets them out of bed in the morning and helps them feel alive.
100%. Well, I think we'll leave there. Again, check out the show notes and some of the things we talked about, and definitely the Scholar Seminar series. We put a lot of work and effort into that, and I think that you'll find it incredibly valuable.